At 55 years old, Nadine Corriveau signed her divorce papers with a borrowed pen, and when she handed them back across the desk, she noticed the lawyer didn't quite meet her eyes. She understood why. There wasn't much to divide. After 28 years of marriage, to a man who had handled all the money, all the accounts, all the decisions she had trusted him to make. There was a joint account with $412 in it, a 10-year-old Civic with a cracked rear bumper, and a cardboard box of her own belongings that she had packed the morning she left, because she hadn't known what else to bring. That's what 28 years looked like, stacked beside a notary's stamp. If you've ever stood somewhere and suddenly couldn't recognize the life you were living, stay with us, because what happened to Nadine over the next 14 months is the kind of story that makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about inheritance, about silence, and about the kind of love that doesn't announce itself. And if this is your first time on Ultra Stories, welcome. We're glad you found us. Hit that subscribe button and keep watching, because this one is going to stay with you. Nadine had grown up in Chapleau, Ontario, a small town in the northern bush where winters came fast and people minded their business by necessity. Her father, Douglas Corriveau, had been a quiet man. Not cold, exactly, but contained in a way that made him hard to read. He ran a small engine repair shop on the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled like motor oil and sawdust and old coffee left too long on the burner. He fixed snowmobiles, chainsaws, ATV motors. He didn't talk much while he worked. He didn't talk much in general. Her mother had died when Nadine was 11. After that, it was just the two of them in the house on Birch Street. Her father coming home with grease under his fingernails, heating up whatever was in the freezer, sitting in the armchair with the newspaper until he fell asleep. Nadine had cooked for him by the time she was 13. She'd learned to be quiet because he was quiet. She'd learned not to ask too many questions because questions made him uncomfortable, made him set down his fork and stare at the window like he was looking at something very far away. She left for Sudbury at 19. She met Gilles at a house party that same autumn. Charming, loud, certain of himself in a way that felt exciting to a girl who'd grown up around silence. They married when she was 26. She called her father from a payphone to tell him, and he said, "All right then, Nadine," and she heard him breathe for a moment before he said, "I'll be there." He was. He sat in the second row and he wore his good jacket, and he didn't make a speech at the reception. But when she hugged him goodbye, he held on a little longer than usual. She remembered thinking that was something. For years she called every Sunday, he answered. They talked about the weather, about the shop, about small things. When she asked if he was doing all right, he said yes. When she asked if he needed anything, he said no. She sent him a card at Christmas and he sent one back, always the same kind, the ones with the cardinal on the snowy branch, the kind you buy at the pharmacy in a box of 12. Douglas Corriveau died of a heart attack on a February morning, alone in his shop, with the space heater running and a carburetor on the bench in front of him. He was 71 years old. The neighbor found him because the shop light had been on for 2 days straight. Nadine drove up for the funeral. Gilles did not come. He had a thing, he said. He was sorry. She sat in the church in Chapleau and looked at the 12 people who had come, and she thought, this is a small life. She thought it the way you think something you're ashamed of. Quickly, then away from it. She was wrong. She just didn't know it yet. The lawyer who handled her father's estate was a man named Mr. Brulé, who worked out of an office above the hardware store in Chapleau and had clearly known Douglas Corriveau better than Nadine had realized. He shook her hand with both of his and said her father had spoken of her often. She didn't know what to do with that, so she nodded and sat down. The estate, Mr. Brulé explained, was modest in some ways and surprising in others. The house on Birch Street was paid off. That part she'd expected. The shop had some equipment that could be sold, some receivables, some leftover inventory. Standard enough. But then Mr. Brulé opened a second folder. Her father had also owned a piece of property outside of town. A fishing camp, technically. 6 cabins and a small main lodge on Lac Désert, about 40 minutes north on a gravel road that didn't show up on most maps. He'd acquired it 17 years ago privately from an old trapper named Eustace Bellamy, who had no family and needed someone to take it on. He never mentioned it, Nadine said. Mr. Brulé nodded as if this were not surprising. He kept it separately. He visited regularly. The property taxes are paid through the end of the year. What's it worth? Mr. Brulé made the kind of face that means the answer is complicated. As it stands, he said, not a great deal. The cabins need significant work. There's no road maintenance in winter. The lodge needs a new roof. He paused. I had someone go out and look at it. As a raw transaction, land, structure, access, perhaps $40,000, perhaps less. Nadine looked at the folder. $40,000 and a derelict fishing camp in the bush was not nothing. But it was not a solution to a life she had to rebuild from scratch at 55. She took the folder home to the house on Birch Street and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked at the photographs. 6 brown cabins in the trees. A dock with 3 boards missing. A main lodge with a hand-painted sign above the door that she had to lean close to read. It said, "The Corriveau Camp. All are welcome." She sat with that for a long time. She hadn't planned to go out to the camp right away. She had things to deal with. The house to sort through. A moving pod. She'd arranged to collect the last of her things from Sudbury. A phone call she needed to make to her younger brother Raymond in Timmins about the shop equipment. She had a life falling apart in one direction, and an inheritance she didn't understand in another, and she was very tired. But 3 days after the funeral she drove out there. She told herself it was just to look. The gravel road was exactly as Mr. Brûlé had described it, rutted, narrow, bordered on both sides by black spruce that blocked the light. It took her 42 minutes and she had to stop twice to be sure she was still on the right track. Then the trees opened up and she saw it. The lake was still. February still, the surface a flat gray beneath the overcast sky, the far shore just a dark line of trees. The cabins were arranged in a loose arc at the edge of the clearing, each one numbered with a small cedar plaque nailed by the door. The main lodge sat back from the water, bigger than it had looked in the photographs. She walked the property alone for almost an hour. She looked inside each cabin through the dusty windows. Cots, a wood stove, a hook for coats, a small table. Spartan but solid. Her father had built the bunks himself. She could tell by the joinery, the same dovetail corners he'd used on the workbench in his garage when she was small. When she got to cabin 6, she almost kept walking, but something stopped her. The other cabins were numbered, obviously, 1 through 5, and then when she turned the corner she saw the 6th cabin. It had a plaque like the others, but it wasn't labeled 6. The plaque said, "Last one." Nadine stood in front of it in her coat with her breath clouding the cold air, and she reached out and touched the letters. They were carved deeply, deliberately, not painted on. Someone had taken their time. She tried the door. It opened. The inside of this cabin was different, not dramatically, but enough. There was a proper quilt on the cot instead of a bare mattress. A small shelf with 3 books on it. A tin of tea bags that still had some in it. A jar of matches. And on the small table beside the wood stove, a candle that had been burned more than halfway down, as if someone had sat in that cabin and used it. Recently. She looked around for a long time. Then she went to the lodge. The main lodge was dim inside but dry. Better than she'd expected from the photographs. There was a long communal table, 8 chairs, a kitchen area, and along the back wall, open shelving with mugs and plates in mismatched sets. There was a wood stove large enough to heat the whole space. There was on the wall beside the door, a small wooden cabinet with a glass front. Inside the cabinet, 6 hooks. 5 of them held keys, each with a cedar tag matching the cabin numbers, 1 through 5. The 6th hook was empty. She stood looking at that empty hook for a moment longer than made sense. Then she walked behind the counter to what appeared to be a back storage room, and on the shelf above the old radio, she found what must have been her father's logbook, a large cloth-bound register, the kind you see in old hardware stores, green cover, brass corners, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. She almost didn't open it. She wasn't sure why. Then she did. And what she found inside her father's handwriting. Careful, small, the same printing he had used on birthday cards when she was a child. Changed everything she thought she knew about Douglas Corriveau. We need to take a breath here, because what Nadine found in that logbook is the kind of thing that makes you reconsider silence. Makes you understand that sometimes the people who say the least are carrying the most. Stay with us. The logbook went back 17 years, to the month her father had acquired the property. The first entry was in March, brief and administrative, noted the transfer from Eustace Bellamy, listed the condition of each cabin, made note of necessary repairs, standard enough. But then a few months later, in June of that first year, there was a different kind of entry. June 14, family from Hearst. 3 children, 1 with a bad cough, father out of work, nights still cold. Put them in last one, no charge. Left firewood, they stayed 4 nights then the next. Through July, August, more inventory notes, repair lists. Then in October, October 22, Man traveling alone wouldn't give a name. Coming from somewhere he didn't want to talk about. Put him in last one, left the lamp on. He was gone by morning. Nadine sat down on the floor of the back room. There were no chairs. She kept reading. Page after page, year after year. In her father's small, careful printing, the logbook turned out to be two things at once. The front half of each page was administrative. Maintenance dates, supply runs, what needed fixing before the next season. The back half, the part she had nearly missed because the pages were so densely packed with shorthand notations. That half was something else entirely. It was a record. Every person or family Douglas Corriveau had quietly put in the last one cabin over 17 years, with no charge and no questions asked. He had not recorded their full names, only first names when they offered them, or descriptors when they didn't. He had noted what they seemed to need. He had noted what he left for them. August 9, elderly woman, traveling alone, car trouble on the 129, waited with her until CAA. Cabin last one overnight, no charge, I made soup. November 3, 2 women, they needed to not be found for a while. Last one for 10 days, I bought groceries twice. They left a note I found later under the pillow. It said, "Thank you for not asking." March 17, young man, maybe 22. He looked the way people look when they have run out of options. Last one. I gave him the firewood for my truck. He stayed a week. Before he left, he fixed the step on cabin 4 that I'd been meaning to get to. There were 41 entries over 17 years. 41. And Douglas Corriveau, the man who hadn't talked much, who'd heated up frozen dinners and fallen asleep in his armchair and sent Christmas cards with cardinals on snowy branches, never told a single person. Nadine sat on the floor of that storage room until the light outside had shifted from gray to dark. And she got up, drove back to Chapleau in the dark on the rutted road, and sat in her father's kitchen and cried for the first time since she'd arrived. She had planned to sell the camp. She told herself she was being practical. She couldn't afford to maintain a property she didn't live near. She had no income. The divorce had left her with a part-time bookkeeping job she'd held for 11 years that barely covered rent, and she was 55 years old and starting over, and being practical was the only thing that made sense. She called a property assessor in the second week. She arranged for a second walkthrough. She sat down with Mr. Brulé and talked about timeline, and he was kind and careful and practical himself. And then, on a Thursday afternoon in early March, her phone rang. It was a woman she'd met once in town, Doreen Fournier, who ran the post office in Chapleau and had been a near neighbor of her father's for years. "I just heard you're thinking of selling the camp," Doreen said. She wasn't accusatory about it. She was just quiet for a moment after she said it. "I might have to," Nadine said. Doreen was quiet again. Then she said, "Your father helped my daughter 3 years ago. She was in a bad situation and she needed somewhere to go where nobody would find her for a little while. And Douglas told me about the camp. He told me to tell no one else, and I didn't. But she's safe now. She wanted me to thank him and I never got to pass it on." Nadine sat with the phones against her ear in her father's kitchen. "He never asked for anything," Doreen said. "He just kept the last one open." After she hung up, Nadine went back to the logbook. She read it again from the beginning. Slowly this time. She stopped at the entry from November, the 2 women who had left a note under the pillow. "Thank you for not asking." She sat with that for a long time. Then she called the property assessor and canceled the walkthrough. This is the part of the story we want you to hold on to, because it's easy to gloss over what Nadine was giving up by making that decision. She had no savings. She had no plan. She had a part-time bookkeeping job and a divorce settlement that amounted to less than most people spend furnishing a living room. Saying no to the sale meant saying yes to a problem she didn't know how to solve. But there are some things you can't unknow. She spent 3 weeks in Chapleau going through her father's papers, his shop, his life. She found receipts from the camp going back to when he'd first bought it. She found, in the drawer of his bedside table, a folded piece of paper in a handwriting she didn't recognize. A letter, undated, that said, "Mr. C, I don't know if I would have made it that winter without what you did. I'm all right now. I wanted you to know." No name. No return address. She pinned it to the corkboard above her father's kitchen desk and looked at it every morning while she drank her coffee. In April, she made a decision that most people in her position would have called reckless. She gave up her apartment in Sudbury, month to month anyway, so not much to lose, put everything in a storage unit in Chelmsford, and drove north to Chapleau. She had just enough from the sale of the shop equipment to get through the summer if she was careful. She told herself she would figure out the rest. The first month was hard in ways she hadn't anticipated. The camp was more work than she'd understood from photographs. The dock needed complete rebuilding. Cabin 3 had a leak that had migrated from the roof into the interior wall, and done damage she didn't discover until she started pulling insulation. The pump for the well made a sound that a neighbor eventually told her meant it was about to fail. And it did, at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning in May when the temperature dropped back to 4 degrees. She learned things she hadn't known she was capable of learning. She watched videos on YouTube. She told people this without embarrassment, later, about roof flashing and pump systems and how to repoint the chimney on the lodge. She asked questions at the hardware store. A retired contractor named Bernard Savard, who was a friend of her father's, showed up one Sunday with his tools and a thermos of coffee and worked without being asked. "Your father fixed my auger 3 times and never charged me right," Bernard said when she tried to thank him. He shrugged. "I still owed him." She found out over those months that her father had been owed quite a lot. Not in money, he'd been famously bad at charging what his work was worth, apparently a running joke in the community for 30 years. But in the accumulated quiet goodwill of a man who had simply kept showing up for people without making a thing of it. She fixed the dock in June. She patched the roof on Cabin 3 in July. She got the pump replaced and the chimney repointed. And by August the camp was, for the first time since she could remember, genuinely livable. She opened it to fishing parties that summer. 6 weekends, modest income, enough to cover the property taxes and buy materials for the next round of repairs. And she kept the last one cabin ready. She didn't have a system for it at first. It was more of an instinct. A door she kept unlocked, a cot with clean sheets, a supply of firewood cut and stacked by the door. She told Bernard about it and he looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Yeah, that sounds like Douglas." The first time someone used it that summer, she didn't even know right away. She went to check the cabin on a Tuesday morning and found the cot slept in, the wood stove cold but recently used, and on the table, a neat stack of 3 pieces of firewood, arranged in a kind of thank you, an offering. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, and then she walked back to the lodge and opened the logbook to a fresh page and wrote the date. She didn't know a name. She wrote, "Someone needed a night." The wood was restacked before they left. She kept the logbook in the same place her father had kept it, on the shelf above the old radio. By the end of that first summer she had 4 entries of her own. She stayed through the winter. People thought she was a little crazy for it. The road was impassable for 6 weeks in January and February, and she had to stock supplies in November the way her grandfather's generation had stocked root cellars. She bought a better pair of boots. She split a lot of wood. She read through the winters of her father's logbook entries and understood, for the first time, that this is what he had been doing too. Enduring the quiet and the cold in between, so that the door could be open when it needed to be. She thought about her father a great deal that winter. She thought about the Sunday calls, the weather updates, the carved cardinal cards. She thought about how she had interpreted his silence as absence, his containment as a lack of feeling, and how completely and utterly she had misread him. He had not been a man without feeling. He had been a man who expressed it in a way she hadn't had the context to understand, in split firewood and open doors, and a logbook that no one was ever supposed to find. And she thought about her own marriage too, about 28 years of trusting someone to handle the things she hadn't wanted to look at, and what that had cost her. About arriving at 55 with $400 and a borrowed pen and having to decide, right then, what kind of person she was going to be. That winter, alone in Chapleau, with the snow up past the porch rail and the logbook open on the kitchen table, she started to understand that she had not, in fact, arrived at the end of something. She had arrived exactly where she was supposed to be. Before we tell you the last part of this story, we want to ask you something. Have you ever misread someone close to you? Thought their silence was indifference, their distance a kind of abandonment, and only understood later what they had actually been doing? Leave your answer in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. There's more to this story, and we don't want you to miss it. The following spring, Nadine opened the camp for the season with a small ceremony she held only for herself. She walked the property at sunrise, started with cabin 1, touched the door of each, and ended at the last one. She had repaired the step on the porch. She had replaced the quilt with a new one, heavier, from her father's linen closet, which she had driven to Chapleau to collect. She had also, over the winter, started writing. Not the logbook. That was still its own thing, practical and spare in the way her father had kept it. But in a separate notebook she'd found in the bottom of a box in the lodge's back room, blank, never used, with her father's name written in the front cover. She had started putting down the stories as she understood them, not with names, because there were no names, but with the shape of each one, who they seemed to be, what the weather had been, what she had left for them, and what, if anything, they had left in return. She wasn't sure what she would do with it. Maybe nothing. But she thought of that letter in the bedside drawer. I don't know if I would have made it that winter without what you did. And she thought that it mattered. It had to matter. To write these things down. To keep a record that said, someone was here. Someone needed a night. The door was open. In the second summer a woman arrived. She drove up the gravel road in a car with Manitoba plates, and she sat in her car in the clearing for a long time before she got out. Nadine watched from the lodge window. She did not go out right away. She had learned from her father's logbook that the going out right away was not always the right move. When the woman finally got out of the car, Nadine walked across the clearing toward her. The woman was perhaps 40, carrying a duffel bag and looking the way people look when they have been driving without sleeping enough and haven't yet decided if stopping was the right choice. I heard there was a place up here, the woman said, from someone who... She stopped. Someone told me about it. There is, Nadine said. She showed her to the last one cabin. She'd made tea and left it in a thermos on the table. She pointed out the wood stove and the stack of birch beside it, and told her the outhouse was 10 steps to the left, and she was welcome to use the lodge kitchen in the mornings. For how long? The woman asked. As long as you need, Nadine said. She stayed 9 days. She and Nadine didn't talk much. A few exchanges at breakfast, a walk along the shore, once when the woman seemed ready for company, an evening on the lodge porch with tea and the sound of loons across the water. On the morning she left, she knocked on the lodge door, and Nadine answered it, and the woman handed her a folded piece of paper. I wrote down the name of the person who told me about this place, she said. I thought you might want to know. Nadine unfolded it. The name on the paper was the young man from her father's logbook, the March entry, the one who had looked like he had run out of options, who had fixed the step on cabin 4 before he left. 17 years later, he was passing it on. Nadine stood in the doorway, and the woman was already crossing the clearing toward her car, and the morning was still, and the lake was flat and silver at the tree line, and Nadine thought, all the years you thought you were lost, you were finding your way here. She went inside. She opened the logbook. She picked up her pen. She wrote the date, and beneath it, one more. The last one was ready. There's something that happens when you discover that someone you thought you knew was living an entirely different life in the quiet spaces between what you saw. Not a secret life in the dark sense, but a life of small, sustained generosity that they never needed you to witness. It reconfigures something. Changes the way you read your own history. Nadine Corriveau spent months sitting with her father's silence and finding inside it something so much larger than she had ever imagined. She is still there. At the camp on Lac des Airs, 40 minutes north on a road that doesn't show up on Fost maps. The camp is open for fishing parties in summer and fall. The lodge roof is fixed now. The dock is solid. There is a logbook on the shelf above the old radio, green cover, brass corner, and the last one cabin is always ready. If you found something in this story that stayed with you, maybe a memory of someone you misread, or a door someone left open for you when you needed it, we'd love to hear it in the comments. Those stories matter. And if you're new to Ultra Stories, we're glad you found us. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay close. There are more stories like this one. Quiet people, hidden kindnesses, ordinary lives that turn out to be anything but. Keep the light on for the next one who needs it.